Sometimes the truth is stranger than fiction. And today, I'm going to share 3 stories that all demonstrate that. But before we get into today's stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do, and we upload 2, 3, even 4 times a week. So if that's of interest to you, please offer to beautifully and meticulously detail the like button's car. But when you take possession of their car, just fill it with water and then leave. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's stories. Late at night on October 26, 1968, a 72-year-old woman named Ethel Harris was sitting in her living room in Toledo, Ohio, when her phone rang. And the first thing she did when it rang was looked at the clock. It was 10:30 p.m. Like, this is not when people called her. And so worried something was wrong, she got up and she answered the phone and she said hello. And on the other end of the line, somebody said back, "Hey sis." And Ethel immediately knew who this was. It was not a sibling, despite the greeting, "Hey sis." It was someone that was very close with her and her husband, Dawn. In fact, this person who she was speaking to was Dawn's best friend, a 59-year-old man named Lee Epps. And for decades, Lee and Ethel and Dawn had lived next to each other. They were neighbors, and basically every day they were at each other's houses together. I mean, they were super duper close. But Lee had eventually moved to another town, and so they didn't see each other as much, but they did get together a fair amount. And also Lee, very regularly, would call the house and just check in. And so Ethel's thinking, okay, it's a little bit late, 10:30 at night, but it's Lee, so clearly he's just calling to check in. But before Ethel could really even respond to his greeting of, "Hey sis," because that's what he called her, sis, he just kept on talking. It was as if, Ethel wasn't even there. He was just sort of delivering a message. He was like, "Hey sis, I'm feeling really bad. Like, I've never felt this way before. And, I really need your husband, Dawn, to get in touch with me the moment he gets back." And then Lee hung up. And Ethel, after, the phone call died, she was really confused because one, it seemed like a sort of normal catch-up call, but he's saying something that sounded really serious, that, something's going on with him. But also two, what immediately stood out to her was, how did he know Dawn wasn't there at the moment? Like, he wasn't nearby. How could he have just guessed that Dawn wasn't home right now? Because Dawn wasn't. He was out. He was going to be home soon, but he was out at the time he said it. It was like he had this knowledge that he was gone. And so it just seemed odd that he knew that piece of information. And so because she was sort of confused by this call and worried about Lee, considering what he said, she tried calling him back. But Lee didn't answer. She tried several more times, never heard from Lee. And then eventually her husband, Dawn, he came home and she explained to him, like, "Yeah, I got this weird call from Lee. He said, he wanted you to get in touch with him as soon as he came back because he's not feeling good or something. I don't really know." So Dawn's like, "All right, that's weird." So he tries calling Lee and Lee doesn't answer. And so at this point, Dawn, he's like, "Ethel, go over it again. Like, what exactly did he say? Like, did he sound scared? Did he sound confused? Like, what was he talking about?" And Ethel said, like, "I don't know. He just sort of stated that he just didn't feel good and he had never felt this way before and he just really wanted to talk to you, Dawn. But again, he mentioned you were out of the house. I don't know how he knew that. And he said to have you call when you came back. That's really what happened. I don't understand it either." And so because Ethel and Dawn really didn't know what to make of this, and just given the fact that maybe Lee could be in trouble, they were like, "You know what, let's just drive over to his house in the other town and just check on him. Just make sure he's okay." So they hop in the car, they drive to Lee's house, and Lee's not there. And so even though it was late at night, Ethel and Dawn really were worried about their friend, and so they began knocking on neighbors' doors to see if anybody knew where he was. But it would take a while, but eventually one of the neighbors said that Lee actually was at the hospital. And at this, Ethel and Dawn, it's like their worst fears are confirmed. Something really is wrong with their friend. And so they went to the nearest hospital, which is called Mercy Hospital. And when they got there, they learned that yes, Lee was admitted to the hospital. But unfortunately, he was dead. And this on its face was, of course, shocking news for Ethel and Dawn. I mean, they did not expect to find out that their friend of many decades was, abruptly and sort of inexplicably dead. But that was far from the most shocking thing they learned. When they spoke to the medical staff about what actually happened to Lee, they would eventually tell Ethel and Dawn that after some complications, Lee ultimately passed away at precisely 10:30 p.m. the previous night. His actual time of death exactly coincided with the moment Ethel got that phone call from Lee, where he said to her, "I just don't feel right. I've never felt this way before. Please, when your husband Don gets home, have him call me." Ethel and Dawn have no way to prove this, but they believe that that phone call was actually Lee's spirit, his soul, trying to talk to his best friend one more time before he passed away. Thank you to DraftKings Sportsbook for sponsoring today's episode. I love to place bets during the playoffs. No matter the sport, the playoffs are just awesome. There's nothing like betting on a game when everything is on the line. It just makes it so much better. Do you love the thrill of live betting? Do you want to wager on the next big play or your favorite player's next move? Well, DraftKings has you covered. And there's even a special offer for new customers. Bet $5 and get paid in bonus bets if your bet wins. Minimum minus 500 odds required. Stay in on the action and use your bonus bets on DraftKings same-game parlays for a shot at an even bigger payout. And if for some reason sports betting is not yet available in your state, don't fret. You can still join in on all the fun with DraftKings Pick 6 and have the shot to win cash prizes. New customers bet $5 and get extra bonus bets if your bet wins. Minimum minus 500 odds required. The crown is yours. Download the DraftKings Sportsbook app and sign up using promo code MrBallen. Again, that's promo code MrBallen. One afternoon in the summer of 2006, a 70-year-old man named Ma Qingmao and several of his family members walked out of their house in Luowan Village, which was a very small community in rural China. Luowan Village was known for being this beautiful, historic place, and as Qingmao and his family walked along, they passed by these beautiful, lush fields and saw these tall mountains off in the distance. But they also passed by something that made Qingmao and his family all very sad. The charred remains of dozens of burned out buildings were just littering the landscape. So Qingmao had lived in this village his whole life, and he remembered when it really was this happy, tight-knit community of over 100 people, and it really was just this picturesque place to live. But 3 years ago, that had all changed, and life in this village really became one disaster after another. There had been not one, but two enormous fires, which were caused by faulty wiring, but they had destroyed all these homes and businesses and all these historic buildings. I mean, it really kind of like changed the entire face of this town, and they still hadn't rebuilt it yet. But as bad as those fires were, it was actually what happened after the fires stopped burning that really, really made this place a nightmare on earth. And it was that for whatever reason, the mortality rate in this little village in China just spiked like mad. It was like all these people were just dropping dead out of nowhere. And it got to the point where the villagers were scared that like some illness was plaguing them, some unseen plague they didn't even know. And it got so bad, so many people were dying, that they brought in the Centers for Disease Control, the CDC. They came in and actually did a full-blown investigation of this village. And they concluded that there is no connection between all these deaths. All these people that are dying in your village are dying from common illnesses or old age. Like, these are natural deaths. It's just this sort of anomalous spike in the mortality rate, and it's unfortunately, following this horrible tragedy, which were these fires. So it's basically like a tragic set of coincidences that these terrible things are befalling the village all at the same time. But a lot of people, including Qingmao, didn't buy that what was happening was natural. Instead, a lot of people began to think that their village was cursed. And so Qingmao and his family, they walked past all these burned out buildings and they made their way towards the center of the village where there was a temple. because there was going to be yet another funeral for another person in their village, a young woman who had died inexplicably, at least in the eyes of the villagers. It didn't make sense she had died, but, apparently it's, a natural cause according to the CDC, but they were going to another funeral. And so into the temple they went, and before long, the procession began. Later that night, Ching Mao stumbled his way through the dark streets of the village towards his home. Following that funeral, Ching Mao and his family had gone to the deceased woman's family home for this big ceremonial dinner that was typical after these funerals. And Ching Mao's family, they had basically left pretty much right after the meal itself. But Ching Mao, he was feeling kind of down, like many people in the village, considering their sort of cursed status, as they believed. He had stayed behind, and he had continued eating and drinking some alcohol and talking with his neighbors. Now he was finally on his way back home. But as he walked, he suddenly felt this really sharp pain in his gut, and it hurt so bad that it was making it really hard to walk. And so Ching Mao clutched his stomach and really had to force himself to keep moving one foot in front of the other. And then finally, when he got to his home, he opened up the front door, but the pain was so blinding that he just screamed out for help and then collapsed onto the ground right inside the house. And then Ching Mao, as he's laying on the ground, he began vomiting uncontrollably onto the floor. And then he just passed away right there, right in front of his whole family. Now, Ching Mao himself was not like a hugely influential person in this village. He'd been there his whole life, and everybody knew him, of course. But there was just something about his death that felt really monumental. It was like everybody in the village felt it, that when he died, for no apparent reason really, it just felt like enough is enough. There is no way these deaths that have ravaged our village are natural. It's not possible, and we will not take that as an answer any longer. And so the village director, who basically is like the mayor of the village, he wound up getting in touch with the provincial health department, and he told them what was going on and what the CDC had already communicated to them and how they didn't buy it. And so this health department, they sent out 20 experts to this village, and they did this big investigation to try to figure out, is there something causing all these deaths? Is it linked to the fires in some way? What's going on in this village? And you know what they came up with? Well, turns out it's all natural. There's nothing wrong here. We believe what the CDC said. There's basically no issues whatsoever. You have nothing to worry about. And the village said, no. We still don't believe that. This is not acceptable. And so they went back to their village director and they said, you got to do something else because this is not acceptable. And he agreed. And so he actually got in touch with the police, just the local police, and said, hey, you come in, you investigate this. Try to see if there's something, anything that they have missed that could maybe explain why so many people are dying in this village. And so the police, they come into this village and they do this broad strokes, very wide sweeping investigation, and they do find something. And what they discover completely explains what's going on in this village. It would turn out the village's doctor, their one doctor, was this guy named Ma Foman. And Ma was not really a doctor. He had basically read a couple of medical books. That was the extent of his training. He was not a doctor. And so he's the guy they're going to whenever they have any medical issues, and he has no idea what he's doing. But he benefited from people getting sick because he's the town doctor. And so you have this guy who can't help you, pretending to help you, likely making it worse, who profits from illness in this village. So that's bad. But it gets worse. Ma was also the owner of the funeral home in this village, the one funeral home. So if his crock science, his crock medicine didn't save you, or if you didn't inexplicably get better basically on your own and you died, he also profited on you. So basically, Ma Foman had a monopoly on suffering in this village. If you got sick, he made money. If you died, he made money. The only way he didn't make money is if you lived. And for a while, Ma Foman just kind of allowed this setup to run as is. He didn't influence it at all. He just was a fake doctor and was the funeral director. But in time, he wanted more money, and so he began poisoning the village's water supply with cyanide, because then you have more people getting sick, makes more money, and more people dying, makes more money. But even that still wasn't enough for Ma Foman. He needed more death and suffering. And so those fires, that was not faulty wiring. That was just luck on Ma Fo Man's part that he wasn't caught. That was pure arson. He burned that place down, killing people in the process. Because again, he's got this monopoly on death and suffering in this village. And so in the end, the police who came in, they did this investigation and they discovered that those fires were actually arson, and it eventually led back to Ma Fo Man. In total, Ma Fo Man killed 76 people. All people that he lived with. These are like his friends and his family. These are his people. He killed 76 of them. And so he was ultimately convicted of murder and he was sentenced to death. One morning in September of 1893, a 25-year-old man named Paul Marsh sat at a dining room table inside of his aunt's house in New Haven, Connecticut. He was there with his mother and his father to visit his aunt, whose name was Miss Blackwood, and also to visit his 19-year-old cousin, whose name was Madeline. Madeline was being looked after by Miss Blackwood because her parents had died 4 years ago, making her an orphan, and Miss Blackwood certainly had the means. She was very wealthy, and so she took Madeline in. And so basically that was her new de facto mother. And so Paul, his parents, and Madeline, they were all having this big, luxurious breakfast that Miss Blackwood's housemaid had prepared for them, and they were waiting for Paul's aunt to wake up and come downstairs and join them. And this was not just like a formality because it was her house and they were, trying to be respectful. No, actually, they loved Miss Blackwood. I mean, Paul's aunt was awesome. She was super energetic and she was really fun. And of course, she was like very wealthy and her house was awesome. And so family generally loved to visit with Miss Blackwood. And so basically everybody's waiting for her to get up to start the day for real. But after a while, when Miss Blackwood had not come downstairs, the group just began eating their breakfast and just figured, maybe she's taking her time and we'll catch up with her, after breakfast or something. So everyone's eating their food and just chatting and having a nice morning, when suddenly the housemaid who had stepped away a few minutes earlier, she comes running into the kitchen. She's very upset and she just yells out that Miss Blackwood is dead. And for a second, Paul was totally confused because just the night before, his aunt had seemed completely normal and healthy. There were no signs that she had any health issues whatsoever. But the family followed the housemaid up to Miss Blackwood's bedroom, and they went inside, and sure enough, there was Paul's aunt laying in bed, cold to the touch. She was definitely dead. Later that morning, Paul and his very distraught family met with Miss Blackwood's regular doctor in the living room of her house. The doctor had just finished examining her body, and he said that, Miss Blackwood really didn't have any clear signs of illness or injury. But he said, she's 70 and she had suffered from heart disease for the last few years, and so very likely heart disease is what ultimately killed her. Now, for the most part, the family all reacted with a mix of obviously sadness, but also like, okay, that logically makes sense. And Paul himself, he felt the same way. He's like, that's really awful. I can't believe she's gone. It makes sense, but he also had this weird feeling that he couldn't quite describe, that just, he felt like something's off here. He couldn't articulate it, but he just immediately had this sense that that could not be the story, that something else happened to his aunt. But Paul didn't say anything to his family. He felt like it was kind of inappropriate to immediately start, suggesting conspiracies about what could have happened to their aunt when, again, logically, it did make sense what the doctor was saying. And so Paul just kind of kept it to himself. But he didn't stop thinking about it. Once the doctor left, Paul and his family decided that they would all just stay in Miss Blackwood's house. They had a funeral to plan, they had to deal with her will and her estate. I mean, there was all these things that were left to do. And the family had already decided they were going to come here and stay for a bit for a visit. So they'd already booked off this time. So the decision was they would just stay and try to sort of help get through this transition process. Fast forward 5 weeks, and Paul and his family are still staying in Miss Blackwood's house, largely because it was proving to be very difficult to sort of manage her estate. She was quite wealthy and going through her will and everything. It was just a huge mess. And so they were still there and they were still trying to figure things out. And by this point, Paul really didn't have a big role in any of that. He was just kind of there really to support his parents as they dealt with the estate. But Paul had kind of taken up his own mission secretly. He hadn't told people about his suspicions that something else must have killed his aunt. He didn't want to tell people that. He felt like he was kind of crazy for thinking it because he had no reason to think it other than a gut feeling. But he had begun sort of investigating. And his investigation had led him to begin sleeping in his aunt's bedroom because he had this belief that maybe his aunt's ghost would visit him in her bedroom and she would tell him or signal to him in some way what really happened to her. Now, for the past several days and weeks that he'd been in here, he had not seen his aunt's ghost. But he was not about to give up, at least not yet. So, on this particular night, this is again 5 weeks after his aunt has passed away, Paul is in his aunt's bedroom, he's in her bed, and he's laying there and he's getting ready to fall asleep. As he's laying there, he begins to hear a strange sound over to the side of the room. It sounded almost like scratching noises. And, the room is very dark. It's late at night. There's a window, but there's not much light coming in from the moon. It's just kind of dark in this room. And he opens his eyes and he rolls over and he looks over in the direction of this scratching sound. And he can't see anything at first. But then, as his eyes kind of adjust to the darkness, he realizes he sees something that he can't believe. I mean, even though in some ways he was hoping to see this, but he sees a hand, like a disembodied hand, actually a whole arm, is basically reaching out of the wall in his direction. And for Paul, he's obviously never seen anything like this before, and he should be terrified. I mean, he's basically seeing a ghost, but he's not scared. He's thinking, this is it. My plan is working. My aunt is signaling to me. She's gonna tell me in some way, shape, or form here what really happened to her. It's finally happening. And so with really no fear, Paul gets out of his bed, walks over to the disembodied arm reaching out of the wall, and he grabs it. After Paul grabbed the ghost arm, screams filled the whole house, woke everybody up. And Paul's father came running down the hall. He burst into the aunt's bedroom and he sees his son and he sees what his son is grabbing. And he really can't even begin to process it. It would turn out there really was an arm reaching through the wall. But it wasn't a ghost arm. It was not, Miss Blackwood's ghost coming back to tell Paul about what happened to her. But this arm did absolutely have something to do with what killed Miss Blackwood, because she did not die of heart disease. When Miss Blackwood was still alive, the person who lived in the room next to her, where they slept, they drilled a hole in the wall big enough for their arm to fit through, and they reached through that hole at night while Miss Blackwood was asleep, and they poured poison into the water she kept by her bedside. They poisoned her to death. And then after she died from being poisoned, it was determined that she had died from cardiac arrest, and pretty much everybody accepted that, except for Paul. The killer was aware, even though Paul was keeping it to himself, that he was on to something. He was sleeping in Miss Blackwood's bedroom. It seemed like he was trying to figure out if there was more to the story than what everybody else seemed to believe, which was heart disease. And when it seemed to the killer like Paul really was getting close to figuring something out, the killer waited for Paul to be in the same bed, and he had a water next to his bed as well. The killer reached through and tried to do the same thing to Paul that they had done to Miss Blackwood. They tried to pour poison into his drink to kill him. But Paul was looking for a ghost in the room. He heard the sound of the arm coming through, and he grabbed the arm thinking it's his aunt's arm, but he really actually was stopping the arm from putting poison in his drink, and the screams were the sound of the killer realizing they've been caught. And the killer was none other than Paul's own cousin, the 19-year-old Madeline. After her parents died, Miss Blackwood took her in like her own child. And because she adopted Madeline, she put Madeline on her will. She was going to inherit Miss Blackwood's wealth. And Madeline just couldn't stand waiting for Miss Blackwood to die in order to get that wealth. And so she decided she would kill her. After Madeline was caught, she quickly confessed to Paul and his parents that yes, she had done it. And so Paul and his parents sent for the police to come out here and arrest Madeline for murder and also attempted murder of Paul. But before the police could even get there, Madeline suddenly began bleeding heavily from her mouth, and then she collapsed and died. It's not clear what actually killed her, but it's entirely possible, if not likely, that she actually used the same poison she had used to kill her aunt on herself to avoid facing justice. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have hundreds of videos for you to binge right now. But if you're looking for a recommendation from me of that one video that's worth your time, well, it's this one right here. So give it a watch. All right, until next time, see ya. Today we have two stories that are each about people who really craved attention or status. But instead of getting that, they got carnage. But before we get into today's stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do, and we upload 2, 3, even 4 times every week. So if that's of interest to you, please offer to get new tires for the Like Button's car. But don't tell them you're replacing their regular tires with monster truck tires. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's stories. One afternoon in early September of 2004, 20-year-old Derek Keeper sat at a desk in the newspaper lab at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, furiously typing on one of the school's desktop computers. The lab that Derek was in was the hub of the university's school paper, the Daily Nebraskan. So there were some other students who were in the space that were talking or working at other computers. But Derek didn't notice any of them. He was completely locked in on what he was doing and writing as fast as he could. Because after he was done with the article that he was working on, he had a ton of other responsibilities that he needed to tackle. So Derek was involved in a lot of stuff at school. He was in a fraternity, he was a senator in the student government, he was a research assistant for the library, and he was pursuing 5 different majors. And Derek took all of his various commitments very, very seriously. But the column he was currently writing was really the one he had the most fun with. So Derek was from a small city in Nebraska, and even though he'd always been, personally a very loud and opinionated person, he'd never had a real platform for talking about all the ideas and points of views that he had. And so this column really gave him the opportunity to finally, actually present these big ideas to the students at school, and he hoped would likely provoke lively discussions around campus about his ideas. After all, Derek loved a good debate. And so he would intentionally choose to write about really complex issues that would get his readers fired up, like the ongoing war in Iraq and the future of the Republican Party and all the things that were wrong with local politics. The tone he went for when he wrote and talked about these kind of, contentious things was often very sarcastic, very blunt, and provocative. I mean, he really thrived on creating discourse and getting people to passionately disagree with him. And they usually definitely did, to the point where some even would get very mad with him. A lot of times the paper's readers would write furious letters or even send hate mail about what Derek had written. But Derek was really not bothered by that at all. In some ways, that was his aim, to get people all riled up. And he was sure that the article he was writing right now was going to be even more divisive than really anything else he had written. For Derek, though, really for him, it was all about individual freedoms and encouraging people to say no to government overreach in their daily lives. I mean, that really was sort of his general stance on everything. That's really what inspired him to do any of this in the first place. In fact, this particular column that Derek was writing was about how he was advocating for abolishing a set of state and federal laws that were trying to control personal choice and the right to decide what was best for one's body, and he was against it. Now, to be clear, the stakes for this issue were life and death. I mean, literally. But Derek believed that the fundamental freedom of being an American was the right to make your own decisions, even if it meant risking your own personal safety. And so as Derek sort of furiously typed away, he was encouraging everyone, like senators and politicians, everybody, to have the same kind of intensity that he had about this issue, to be just fully bought in on this idea of, as Americans, we need individual freedom. And then finally, when he was all done typing, Derek sat back and proofread the whole thing, and when he got to the last line, he got chills. It said, quote, "I just wish we could keep the government out of our pocketbooks and out of our personal decisions." Derek loved that line, and so he nodded, satisfied with his work. He had nailed it. Then he emailed his draft to his editor with a big smile on his face. Derek's article went to print just a few days later, on September 17th. And like most of Derek's other articles, this one for sure got a lot of angry emails and letters from people who disagreed with what Derek had to say. But all the vitriol in these messages just proved to Derek that his article had clearly been a success. He had sparked outrage and got people talking about this issue. Derek even hoped that maybe some of the readers got angry enough to actually take action. That's what he wanted. He wanted his writing to genuinely inspire. The rest of Derek's semester was a total blur. He kept writing his weekly column on top of all of his other obligations and exams and everything else, and before he knew it, the semester was over, and he was headed to his mother's house in Texas for Christmas break. A few weeks later, on January 4th, 2005, at 3 a.m., Derek rode in the back seat of a Ford Explorer SUV on his way back to school after the break. He'd caught a ride from his mother's home in Texas with two of his fraternity brothers who were sitting up front. And Derek had spent the first part of this just awful 13-hour-long drive doing what he did best, using his sarcasm to make his friends laugh, and he was also engaging them in really animated conversations. And so, the first 6 to 8 hours had sort of flown by. But now, it's basically the middle of the night still, / very early morning, and everybody had just gone quiet because they were all exhausted from this truly awful, long drive. All any of them wanted to do at this point was just get back to campus and be done. And eventually, Derek and his friends were very close to campus. They were finally in Nebraska, and they were driving down Interstate 80, which was a snowy, cold highway not far from the school. And Derek was really excited to start the new semester. He'd had a nice, laid-back holiday where he'd caught up on sleep and spent a lot of time just kind of hanging out and seeing his younger siblings. But Derek just was not the kind of person who liked slowing down for very long. And so he was quite eager to get back to his busy life on campus. Especially, he really wanted to get back to his column. He had had a lot of downtime and was able to, brainstorm and come up with some good potential new topics for the column. But he really wasn't sure if any of those ideas were going to top, the very controversial article that he had published back in September. People were still talking about that one. And Derek was still thinking about it too. In fact, his own words and advice to his readers were still ringing in his ears and guiding his everyday decisions. But for now, Derek just leaned his head up against the cold glass window of the car and waited for this long trip to finally be over. But suddenly, he felt the SUV lurch. And before he knew what was happening, he heard a deafening bang and he heard his friends screaming. Just minutes later, a police officer was flying down Interstate 80 in his cruiser. Eventually, he spotted a group of ambulances parked on the side of the road, and he knew that's where he needed to go, so he pulled over to the side and stopped. And when he got out, he saw in a ditch just off the highway was an overturned SUV. The officer immediately jumped out of his cruiser and rushed towards the vehicle. And when he got there, he found the scene was just absolutely chaotic. There were a team of paramedics who were at the window of the SUV trying to assess the condition of the victims inside and to get them out. And when the officer kneeled down to look inside as well, he could clearly see two people inside the vehicle. Now, both of them seemed basically fine beyond, obviously being in a wreck. I mean, they were banged up and clearly dazed, but their injuries didn't look immediately life-threatening. So, sort of relieved, the officer backed away to let the paramedics do their thing. But very quickly, the officer noticed that more paramedics were actually running past the SUV to something on the ground a few feet beyond it. And so the officer followed them to go see what it was they were running to. And when he saw what was on the ground, the officer just kind of stopped and knew instinctively that there was nothing anybody could do. I mean, there was a body of a young man on the ground who clearly was a third passenger of this SUV, but their body was just mangled almost beyond recognition. It would turn out Derek had been right. His September 17th, highly contentious column in the Daily Nebraskan would be his most controversial and famous piece ever. And actually, people are still talking about it today. Because his column was about how, we, all us Americans, reserve the right to make our own choices about our bodies and personal safety. And Derek believed that there was a law that was actually directly infringing on that right, which was the law that was forcing people to wear a seatbelt. Derek despised this requirement. He thought seatbelts should be just a personal decision about safety. To him, it was not just about buckling up, it was about individual choice, about freedom. And on January 4th, that SUV that Derek was riding in going back to school, well, the driver hit some ice on the road and lost control. The driver and the other passenger in the front were wearing seatbelts. But Derek, in keeping with his beliefs, was not. And so when the SUV crashed and flipped over, Derek alone was killed. As one reporter pointed out, Derek lived by his beliefs, and he also died by them. Have you ever wished you could consume the strange, dark, and mysterious in a live storytelling event? Well, that dream is becoming a reality this year because I'm coming back with another live tour. This year's tour is also going to include a whole bunch of new locations, including the West Coast of the United States, all across the United States, and also one international city. We put together an absolutely amazing show with a whole bunch of awesome stories, including stories you will not hear anywhere else. New content you can only get if you come to this show. But if you want to see it, you got to act fast because tickets are available right now. If you want tickets, go to tour.ballenstudios.com or click the link in the description below. Again, that is tour.ballenstudios.com. Also, I'm going to be giving away an all expenses paid for trip to come meet me at one of my live shows. That will include airfare, hotel, come hang out with me backstage. It's going to be a whole thing. And so if you want to potentially win that, all you have to do is donate to win at fandiem.com/MrBallen. That is fandiem.com/MrBallen. Get your tickets and enter the sweepstakes today. I can't wait to see you at the show. Just before 9 p.m. on Friday, January 13th, 2012, 51-year-old Francesco Scatino and his girlfriend, Dominica, sat at a table in a crowded restaurant at a resort in Italy. And they'd been there for a while, having a leisurely meal. So their table was covered with empty dishes, a wine decanter, and plates with the remnants of their amazing food. Now, having an extended, indulgent dinner like this one was not technically allowed, since Francesco was actually working. But Francesco was not too worried about breaking what he considered to be a small rule, because he was not just some hired hand. I mean, he was in charge of this entire resort on Italy's Tuscan coast. And the resort was amazing. It was literally right out on the water and had thousands of guest rooms and 6 restaurants with over a dozen bars, a theater, multiple swimming pools, and there was even a casino. So it had really a huge capacity for guests. And right now, there were easily more than 3,000 people staying at this resort. And Francesco was, very proud to be the boss of this place, this unbelievable place. He actually had started working at this resort as a security guard, but he'd worked his way up to the very top. And now he'd been overseeing this property for about 6 years. And being a leader really worked well for his personality, because he loved being impressive and feeling important. He'd heard staff and former coworkers complain about how he was too over the top and a bit of a show-off, so he had heard those things. But Francesco knew that really these people, they were just jealous. He was handsome, he had a great job, and he had 2 just beautiful, amazing women in his life when, some people didn't have any. And so now Francesco smiled at one of his girlfriends, Dominica, who sat across the table from him and enjoying the dessert they were sharing. Francesco was married, but recently, Dominica had become the most important woman in his life. She was a dancer, and to him, she was just perfect. They'd only met a few weeks ago, so they were still in the honeymoon phase, where they were both still very flirtatious and eager to impress one another. And so right now, Francesco knew he should leave and get back to his managing duties, but he was having so much fun with Dominica, so he lingered, eating his dessert as slowly as he could. But as he sat there, slow playing his dessert, He realized, their night together didn't actually have to end just because the dinner was over. There was something he could do right now that would give them maybe another hour or so together. And it would also completely blow Dominica away and prove to her just how amazing he really was. So, suddenly with a big smile on his face, he told Dominica to hurry up, finish eating, because they needed to get upstairs immediately. A few minutes later, Francesco and Dominica hurried into the resort's top floor operations center. And just like the entire rest of the place, this room, despite being an operations center, was still just massively impressive. In addition to all the very new age, high-speed monitors and security feeds and maps all over the room, there was this huge window that overlooked this balcony, this exterior balcony, that looked down on the ocean. It was like this beautiful view of the ocean, and it even overlooked a stretch of small seaside villages called Giglio. This room was also filled with all of Francesco's employees hustling around and, staring at screens and talking on headsets. But as soon as Francesco and Dominica walked in there, Francesco kind of went to the center of the room and kind of got everybody's attention and told them all to listen up. Then he went over the details of his big idea. The resort was going to put on a very specific and spectacular kind of show called a salute. And they were going to do it right now. So salutes were very popular in this area of Italy, and Francesco's resort actually did them all the time, so this was not totally unusual. They were basically kind of a performance, mostly for the locals, where the resort would flash all of its lights and play music, while guests of the resort would go to their balconies and wave and cheer to the residents and the other tourists in Giglio. But critically, salutes needed to be both quick and highly choreographed. That's really the only way they worked. And so in order for a salute to work, it really required the attention and active participation from a large number of people. This was a big to-do. And so given the fact that these were sort of a big endeavor, it meant that, something could go wrong if you're not really careful. And Francesco actually had a mentor who'd actively discouraged him to not do these salutes or try to do as few as you can because of the fact that things could go wrong. But Francesco's mentor was not physically here right now to tell Francesco to stop. And the people that were here were pretty excited about his idea. So Francesco began going over the plan with his staff. And as he expected, with such a complicated undertaking, there were a lot of logistics to look over. However, when Francesco actually started going about these preparations, he realized he couldn't actually read anything because he didn't have his glasses on. He didn't think he looked handsome with them on, so he hadn't brought them out to dinner with Dominica, but now he really needed them. But thinking on his feet, Francesco simply asked a staff member to read him whatever information he really needed to know in order to do this salute. And so the staff member did as they were told, and at the end of it, Francesco felt like he had heard what he needed to hear and he thought everything was in order, and so he nodded and said, "Okay, we are all set to begin." And then he looked over at Dominica and smiled and sort of nodded like, "Okay, here we go." Then she knew whatever was coming next was going to be really, really special. When Francesco gave the actual order to begin the salute, everybody in the operations room jumped into action. And as soon as the actual salute began, Francesco squinted out the huge window that looked out over the ocean and Giglio down below, and Francesco was just so excited when he thought about how everyone who was out and about in town would look up and see his palace all lit up and full of life and energy. But as he peered at the lights of Giglio, he realized something wasn't quite right. Even without his glasses on, he could see that there was something outside in the darkness, just barely illuminated by the town's lights. It was a large shape right between the resort and Giglio. And to his horror, Francesco realized it was actually getting closer, fast. At the same time, but on the other side of the resort, an American man named Brian Aho was eating dinner with his wife and teenage daughter at the Milano restaurant, which was one of 6 restaurants in the resort. And they'd just been enjoying their meal when there was this deafening banging sound, and the entire room gave a huge jolt, and everything inside just sort of went flying. Brian grabbed the table to brace himself as plates and glasses shot off the table and shattered everywhere. And then he heard screams and people hitting the ground all around him as diners were literally being thrown from their chairs. And then there was another series of crashes when some ceiling panels fell from above and smashed onto the ground. But then it was over. The shaking abruptly stopped, and Brian immediately jumped up to make sure that his wife and daughter were okay, and they did seem fine, just dazed like everybody else in the room. As Brian stood up, he could tell he was, mostly okay, also shaken up. But the overwhelming thought was just having no idea what had just happened. I mean, he's looking around and no one seemed to know. It had felt like some kind of earthquake or something. But then Brian thought, if this had been an earthquake, he really had to get his family out of this restaurant immediately in case of aftershocks. But it seemed like all the other diners clearly had the same idea, because before Brian could actually move, there was a surge of activity around him as dozens of people just began rushing towards the exit of the restaurant. And Brian didn't want him or his family to get caught in the middle of this huge crowd. Huge amounts of people running in the exact same direction, a panicked group of people, could easily create a stampede. And he was worried that he and his family could get pulled to the ground and trampled in the chaos. So he looked around and he saw on the other side of the restaurant there was a smaller door that nobody else was going to. So he and his family began making their way over to it. But before they could actually get through this door, the overhead lights began to flicker and then went out. And then with the darkness, suddenly came the blast of emergency alarms echoing through the resort. And then he could hear more screams, not just inside of this restaurant, but sort of all over the place. It was like the resort had devolved into madness. Brian had never been more scared in his whole life. I mean, his pulse was racing faster than he thought was even possible, and he almost felt paralyzed, like this was just too much to even process. He also, like basically everybody else, had no clue what was going on here. But I mean, navigating his family through an emergency was already going to be horrifying and terrifying and dangerous, but now he would also have to do it in the dark. For a moment, Brian and his family just stood there, kind of frozen in the dark. And then Brian was about to tell his family to just go through the door, we'll figure it out in the dark. But then luckily, the emergency lights came on, giving the room sort of a dim, eerie glow. But it was enough to sort of guide their way. And so at that point, Brian didn't wait. He grabbed his wife and his daughter, pushed through the side door, and headed out into the hallway. It would take nearly 10 minutes for Brian and his family to navigate the maze of hallways they had just walked into until finally they stepped outside and were in the open air. But when they finally got out there, Brian realized they actually had a really big problem, because the exit they had just taken had taken them not to safety. It had led them to this expansive outdoor terrace with a railing on the 4th floor of the resort, which meant they still needed to get down multiple levels in order to, evacuate safely. But just the fact they were on the 4th floor was not the big issue. The big issue was the terrace was clearly packed with other people from the resort who were also trying to evacuate. There was all these people basically blocking their way. So basically, everybody who has no idea what's going on is just like pushing and shoving each other, and there were no authority figures or any staff around to actually direct what now was basically an evacuation. And Brian could tell that the crowd was clearly starting to panic, and really he was too. Everybody was just like, what's happening here? And so Brian was about to suggest to his family that they try to find another way out when they heard the crackling of the resort's public speaker system, and a voice came on that finally delivered some information about what was happening. It said that there had been an electrical blackout, but everything was fine, and technicians were hard at work trying to fix the problem. So in the meantime, all the guests should stay calm and just go to their rooms for safety. And at this point, it was very obvious that the mood all around Brian and his family completely changed. People stopped pushing and arguing and panicking, and Brian himself felt that knot of dread in his stomach sort of loosen a bit. I mean, an electrical blackout didn't seem like a life or death situation, so he, and clearly everybody else, felt a whole lot less scared. Pretty much right away, many of the guests began heading back inside, making their way to their rooms. And Brian actually spotted a few staff members who were in the crowd, encouraging people to do just that, go back to your rooms. And so for a few moments, Brian and his family and the others just kind of stayed put and just kind of let things play out, kind of watching things settle back into normal. But then it was like with no warning, there was this other huge banging sound, and the floor once again buckled under Brian's feet. And this triggered a whole new wave of just absolute chaos out on this terrace. All at once, everybody started shouting and pushing each other in pure panic. And at the same time, there were all these new announcements coming out frantically over the loudspeaker, but it wasn't doing anything. It was like the crowd had decided something bad is happening and no one can tell me otherwise. I have to leave. Everybody is just trying to evacuate all at once. And so pretty much right at this point, you had a group of people who were out on the terrace who decided to charge into the resort to try to find another way to evacuate. And also you had the group of people who had already gone back inside to go back to their rooms, who had changed their mind, who charged right back out, back onto the terrace. And so for a moment, it was like these two pools of people kind of smashing into each other. And Brian and his family were kind of off to the side because they had just barely stepped out onto the terrace when all of this stuff was happening. But then Brian watched in complete shock as he saw some of the people, after they pushed through all the way to the edge of the terrace to the railing, they began climbing over the railing to climb down from the 4th floor. Seeing this was horrifying for Brian, but then he felt yet another shudder under his feet and a loud industrial groaning sound from the resort right behind him. And he knew if he didn't do what these people were doing, he and his family might not be able to evacuate. Clearly, there was a real problem. They didn't know what it was, but they had to go. So he grabbed his wife and his daughter's hands, he shoved his way through the crowd to the railing, over the railing they went, and down they began to climb. Meanwhile, back up in the top-level operations center, Francesco was staring out the room's huge window, just completely frozen in shock. His resort was in complete pandemonium. Below, guests were running, others were fighting and shoving, and some were literally leaping to their potential deaths from the upper-level balconies and terraces. And so as Francesco watched all of this carnage, he tried to wrap his head around how the night had gone so horrifically wrong. The worst part of all of it was there was absolutely no way to fix it. He'd been trying to show Dominica and everybody else how amazing and impressive and in control he was. But he'd completely lost control of this whole situation. And he'd also lost his girlfriend because Dominica had quickly fled the resort. And then there was a loud crashing sound somewhere in the distance, and his heart pounded, and he realized it was time for him to start running too. Minutes later, Francesco and some of his staff sprinted through the halls of the resort. And as they ran, thunderous noises and bangs came from every direction, and debris from the ceiling and walls crashed to the ground all around them as they were shaken loose. And all the while, over the noise, Francesco could hear the continuous shrieks of panic from people who were still clearly trapped inside the resort and just couldn't get out. But he and the others he was with finally did make it to the exit. And this exit was not overrun with panicking people. So Francesco was lucky enough to be able to pretty quickly make it to the bottom level and then keep on going. And he did not look back, not until he was far away and definitely to safety. But when he did finally stop running, and he did turn around and looked back at his resort, his stomach pitched so hard he nearly vomited. Because finally, he could see right in front of him the full, horrible extent of what he had done. It would turn out what Francesco was looking at was the culmination of a record number of terrible choices he had made that night. 1. Francesco would later deny this, but he was seen drinking alcohol at dinner while he was supposed to be working. 2. He was not wearing his glasses, which meant he was his most handsome self, but also that he couldn't see very well. And 3. He was distracted by his new girlfriend, who he had brought to an area where only key personnel were allowed because he was desperate to impress her. Now, in most workplaces, this would all just be considered unprofessional and maybe might get you fired. But in Francesco's workplace, it was much worse than that. What he had done was incredibly dangerous because the resort that Francesco managed was not a regular hotel. It was a gigantic cruise ship called the Costa Concordia. Francesco was its captain, and when he issued the order for the boat to do a salute, he was not just ordering a complicated but entertaining show. A cruise ship salute also involves steering the massive boat much closer to shore than usual to appropriately show off to the locals on land. But because Francesco literally couldn't see very well, was obviously distracted and possibly drunk, he didn't notice that when they did this salute, they were going way too fast and way too close to shore. That shape he saw rushing towards them in the darkness was an enormous cluster of rocks. By the time he saw it, it was too late. The Concordia had smashed into the rocks, tearing a 230-foot wide hole in the hull, which immediately flooded the ship. And then, making matters even worse, Francesco delayed rescue efforts for more than an hour by trying to convince people that what had happened was just an electrical outage. And then when he finally did issue an evacuation order, he broke a sacred rule for ship captains. He fled the boat before the remainder of his crew and the passengers. Like he was the first one off. He did not go down with his ship. That American passenger, Brian Aho, and his family would survive, because after they decided to go over the railing, they, perilously climbed down 4 levels all the way to a lifeboat, and so they survived. But unfortunately, 32 other people who were on board the boat ultimately died, all because of Francesco's desire to show off. Francesco himself was ultimately arrested for manslaughter and was sentenced to 16 years in prison. He was subsequently named Italy's most hated man. Thank you so much for watching today's episode. Let me know what you thought of it in the comments below. And remember, we have a whole playlist of Places You Can't Go episodes ready for you to binge right now. So go ahead and click here and give them a watch. All right, until next time, see ya. One night in December of 2011, a man sat in front of his computer, anxiously staring at the words that he had just typed into a chat window. He was about to hit send and share his darkest secret with someone he'd only ever talked to online. And it was the kind of secret that could totally destroy him. And he knew sending it was probably a huge mistake. But the loneliness and the guilt he was feeling was just sort of unbearable. And he felt like he had to tell someone. So, after a long pause, he reached up and he hit send. But before we get into today's story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place, because that's all we do, and we upload 2, 3, even 4 times every week. So if that's of interest to you, please invite the like button to come deep sea fishing with you. But don't tell them that they're going to be the bait. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's story. On the afternoon of Wednesday, November 17, 2010, a 54-year-old woman named Diane Zaleski pulled her car into her driveway in Union Township, New Jersey, which is a small suburb of New York City. Diane was just about to get out of her car and go inside when her cell phone inside of her purse began to ring. She opened it up and she looked at her phone, and the caller ID said it was her sister-in-law, Debbie. So Diane picked it up and she said hello, and immediately Debbie asked her for a favor. She said that she needed someone to drive her to a doctor's appointment the next day, and she was wondering if Diane could do that. And Diane did not have to consult her calendar to know that her schedule tomorrow was wide open. Just a few months ago, she'd retired from her 17-year career as a legal secretary and then had moved to this particular neighborhood to be closer to her aging parents and her brother. And so her only job at the moment was helping out her family, which didn't take up all her time, and tomorrow she was free. So Diane told Debbie, that she'd see her tomorrow, and then the pair hung up. After that, Diane gathered up her things and got out of her car, and then as she was about to walk inside of her home, she stopped and just turned around and looked out at her new neighborhood. And it was really nice here. The block was full of all these beautiful homes and well-kept lawns. This was just a really nice place to live. And so as she was just, staring out at the scene, she saw the woman who lived across the street, her name was Mrs. Yearwood, dragging her garbage cans down to the curb. And so Diane, she waved to Mrs. Yearwood and smiled, and also made a mental note to ask Mrs. Yearwood if her son, whose name was Arnell, was free to shovel her, Diane's, walkway tomorrow, because that night it was supposed to snow. Later that same night, sometime after 10 p.m., Diane was in bed with her laptop open, scrolling through messages on her online dating profile. Now, dating was sort of a normal part of Diane's life. She'd gone out with plenty of men over the years, and she still got hit on pretty aggressively at bars, and she'd even been proposed to once. But despite, meeting lots of men and liking quite a few of them, she just had never gotten married. These days, Diane met most of the men that she went on dates with online, like on a dating site. And on these sites, men seemed to always be messaging her to ask her out. And so far, of the men she actually wound up seeing, only a few had been creeps. And so over time, Diane had sort of cultivated this small roster of men that she kept in touch with and, would meet up with for dates. And so now Diane clicked on the profile for one of the men that was on her roster. It was a man named Kyle Porter, and she was just about to message him this very flirty message when she heard her doorbell downstairs ring. And when she heard this, she was sort of surprised because she definitely was not expecting anybody. But, she still obviously got out of bed and got herself together and headed downstairs to see who it was. And when she unlocked and opened the door, the person standing outside in the cold was somebody that she immediately recognized. Now, she really had no idea what they were doing here right now, but she told them to, come inside and then asked them, what's going on? And then this visitor started talking, and they would say something that Diane never expected. The following day, around noon, Diane's 91-year-old father, Stanley Zaleski, was at home watching TV when his phone rang. He picked it up and he heard the voice of his daughter-in-law, Debbie. And Debbie sounded really worried. And she quickly explained to him that Diane had agreed to drive her to a doctor's appointment that morning, but she hadn't shown up. And now, she was reaching out to Diane, but she wasn't answering, and she also wasn't responding to texts. And Stanley, much like Debbie, was very surprised by this, because this was not like Diane at all. So he told Debbie that he would go over to Diane's place right now and check on her, since after all, he lived a lot closer to Diane than Debbie did. Then they hung up, and Stanley yelled for his wife to come on with him. 20 minutes later, Stanley and his wife, Diane's mom, walked up to the front door of Diane's house. As soon as they got there, Stanley began pounding on the door, yelling for his daughter, but there was no answer. And so eventually, after looking at his wife, and they both are like, what's going on here? He reached down and he tried the door handle to see if the door was unlocked, and he found that it was. So he turned the handle and he just pushed the door open, and immediately his eyes were drawn to the ground inside the house, like right in the foyer, because it was all red. There was blood everywhere. A wave of nausea came over Stanley, and he had to grab the door frame to steady himself. But then after a moment, he turned to his wife, who was right next to him, and he just said, "Stay right here. I'm going to go in and look around." And then he stepped inside, and as he moved further into the foyer, which again, there's just like blood splattered everywhere, he began to notice there were piles of strange white dust that he didn't recognize, sort of amongst the blood. There's no sign of Diane, like it's silent in the house. But as Stanley's standing there, he sees that there's also what appears to be a pretty clear trail, like something had been dragged through the blood and was sort of pulled towards the back of the house. And so Stanley, with his heart racing, he began walking, like following this trail of whatever got dragged through the house, and it made its way to the top of the stairs that led down into the basement. And then when Stanley looked down into the basement, he saw something at the foot of the stairs, like a heap of something that was down there. And after a minute, once his eyes adjusted to the dark down there, he saw it was his daughter. And at that point, he sort of staggered back and he yelled out for his wife to call 911. Half an hour later, around 1 in the afternoon, Detective Robert Henderson of the Union County Homicide Task Force drove his police cruiser into a very nice, quiet neighborhood. His partner, Detective Mike Minacchio, was sitting in the passenger seat. And at some point, Henderson, he pulled up to the snow-covered curb in front of a large house that was in the process of being roped off with crime scene tape. Henderson immediately noticed there was an elderly man and woman being interviewed by officers in the front yard of this house. And as soon as Detective Henderson and his partner got out of their cruiser, one of the officers who was out and about ran over to brief them on what the police knew so far. He explained that the elderly man and woman were the parents of the victim, Diane Zaleski. Diane lived alone, this was her home, and her parents had come over earlier and found her foyer covered in blood, and Diane was found lying dead at the bottom of the stairs in the basement. Henderson asked if there were any signs of a break-in or a robbery, and the officer said no, but he warned them that the scene inside the house was really unusual. It seemed like the killer, after killing Diane, had sort of been all over the house, clearly taking a lot of time to both clean up and also contaminate the scene to make it harder for investigators. And when Henderson heard this, he sort of raised an eyebrow, because in his experience, most killers tried to get away from the crime scene as quickly as possible. They wouldn't just linger like that. And so at this point, Henderson turned to Menacchio and was like, how do you want to split this up here? And Menacchio said he would stay and interview Diane's parents. That way Henderson could go inside and inspect the rest of the crime scene. When you're refreshing your space, choosing a paint color can feel weirdly high stakes. Will that seafoam green that you loved online look more like split pea soup on your walls? Luckily, Sherwin-Williams takes the guesswork out of finding the perfect paint color. With 3 easy ways to sample, you can choose color with confidence, testing shades in your actual space before making the final call. Order color chips, peel and stick, or color-to-go paint samples at swsamples.com or visit your neighborhood Sherwin-Williams store to get started today. Moments later, Henderson stepped through the front door of Diane's house, and he saw the huge amount of blood in the foyer. There was so much that he assumed the murder must have taken place right here in the entryway. There was also a lot of white dust all over the floor that Henderson recognized as fire extinguisher powder. Henderson couldn't see any evidence of a fire, so he guessed that what must have happened here is the killer had sprayed down the area with a fire extinguisher in an effort just to contaminate the scene. Henderson noticed there was a trail of blood that sort of left the entryway and headed towards the back of the house. And so he followed it through the hallway into the kitchen, and in there he saw forensic techs standing around the kitchen sink, which was full of all the soapy water. And as he walked in, Henderson, one of the techs pulled a woman's wallet out of the sink and then set it open on the counter to dry. Henderson walked over to check the ID and saw that it was Diane's wallet. And so this was obviously very weird, but it got even weirder when the forensics tech reached back into the water and then fished out something else, a TV remote. And so at this point, Henderson and the techs realized that what must be going on here is the killer must have been dumping these items in the soapy water to try to clean off fingerprints or DNA. But after seeing all this, it made Henderson really wonder, what state would the body be in when he found it? If the killer's going to these many lengths with just ancillary evidence, what did they do to the body? And so after chatting with the techs for a few minutes about how strange this whole thing was, Henderson turned and continued following that trail of blood on the ground, and it led him to the door that went down to the basement. And so he looked down into the basement, and he saw at the foot of the stairs there was a forensic specialist taking photos of Diane's body, which was, right at the foot of the stairs. When Henderson went down there and actually got a look at Diane's body, he had been bracing for, her body to be in pretty rough shape considering what he had seen upstairs, but he was still taken aback by just how violently Diane clearly had been attacked. Her torso, her neck, and her face were covered in literally more stab wounds than he could even count. And then as Henderson leaned in even closer, he saw there were additional bruises on Diane's face and pretty clear defensive marks on her limbs that told him that there had definitely been a pretty big struggle. Also, some of Diane's clothes had been removed, which made Henderson wonder if Diane had been sexually assaulted. And as awful as that obviously is, if that was the case, the upshot was that there was a good chance the killer's DNA could be recovered from her body. However, at the same time Henderson is thinking this, he began to notice a very harsh chemical smell that was clearly coming from Diane's body. And that's when he spotted a bottle of toilet cleaner that was right nearby, and he realized that the killer must have dragged Diane's body down here and then splashed it with chemicals in yet another attempt to destroy evidence. And so at this point, Henderson was getting pretty worried, because the killer clearly had taken a lot of steps to cover their tracks. And if they had done a thorough enough job and the police couldn't find any usable fingerprints or DNA, they'd be relying primarily on witnesses, which are not necessarily hugely reliable. So Henderson just really hoped that was not going to be the case here. But if it was, he just prayed that someone in the neighborhood had seen something. 10 minutes later, Henderson walked down the icy sidewalk, canvassing the neighborhood with his partner, Detective Menacchio. And as they walked, Manacchio filled Henderson in on the talk that he had just had with Diane's parents. What he'd learned was that Diane had recently moved to this neighborhood and that she also dated a lot, mostly men that she met online. And the fact that she dated a lot of people certainly caught Henderson's attention, because all the evidence that they had found so far in Diane's house suggested that she had been killed by somebody she knew. There were no signs of forced entry, and there was evidence of a long, very deliberate cleanup. So the killer had clearly felt comfortable enough to stick around after the murder and had probably known Diane was single, so they were not going to be interrupted. And so Henderson sort of filed these thoughts away as he and his partner arrived at the next house on the block. Henderson knocked, and a moment later, an elderly woman answered the door. And at that point, Henderson explained about Diane's murder, and then he asked her if she had seen anything suspicious around Diane's place the previous day. Cars parked outside, or, strange people coming and going, anything. Now, this woman was immediately startled by the news of a murder in this neighborhood. That definitely was the primary reaction she had. But, she quickly recovered and said that no, she hadn't seen anything. However, she did remember seeing some kids playing in the yard across the street from Diane's, so maybe they had seen something. Moments later, Henderson and Manacchio stood on the front porch of the house that was directly across the street from Diane's, and they were speaking to a woman in her 50s who'd introduced herself as Mrs. Yearwood. When Henderson explained about the murder across the street, Mrs. Yearwood gasped and said that, she hadn't known Diane particularly well. I mean, she was new to the neighborhood, but she had always been so friendly to her and her family. And in fact, Diane had even paid Mrs. Yearwood's son to help with some small chores around her house. At this point, Henderson sort of, shifted the conversation and just got to the point. He told her that he had heard that there had been some kids playing outside this house the previous day. And were the kids home? Because he really wanted to speak to them to see if they had maybe heard or seen anything strange on Diane's property the day before. Mrs. Yearwood immediately nodded and turned around and walked into the back of the house, and then a moment later came back with an 11-year-old boy who looked very nervous. And so Henderson, to disarm him, immediately knelt down and touched him on the shoulder and just said, "Look, we're trying to catch a bad guy." And then Henderson pointed across the street and asked the boy had he seen anything strange at Diane's house the day before. The boy, at this point, looked past Henderson over at Diane's house and then back at Henderson, and he just shook his head and said no. And at this point, Henderson, he felt his stomach sink, because with a deeply contaminated crime scene and apparently no good witnesses, this case was already off to a horrible start. Around noon the following day, December 19th, Detective Henderson sat in his office reading through Diane Zaleski's autopsy report. He'd been anxiously waiting for this file all morning, but unfortunately it did not contain much information that he had not already guessed. Diane's time of death was estimated to be between 10 p.m. and 1 a.m., so 11 to 14 hours before her parents found her body. She had been strangled and beaten and also stabbed more than 40 times. The damage was so severe, the medical examiner couldn't actually say which injury killed her. And also the knife that was used in the attack had never been found. They also couldn't tell if Diane had been sexually assaulted, because the chemicals that had been splashed on her body had destroyed any DNA the killer might have left behind. The forensics team also had not pulled any usable fingerprints from the house, thanks to the killer's cleanup efforts. But they did find something that was even better. There were a few drops of fresh blood at the crime scene that did not match Diane's DNA, and early tests showed that they came from an adult male. Now, it was possible that this blood was from someone other than the killer, but Henderson didn't think so. There had clearly been some sort of a struggle between the killer and Diane, so it seemed likely that Diane had managed to wound the killer and maybe draw blood, and maybe this was it. And so now, the game had changed. Henderson's next task would be to collect DNA samples from all the men closest to Diane and compare them to this fresh blood at the crime scene. Now, the digital forensics team had Diane's laptop, and they were working really hard to try to access her online dating profile to try to figure out who she'd been chatting with, because those were definitely some people they might want to compare DNA with. But while Henderson, thought that was great, he wasn't going to wait. He felt like he needed to move on this right now, and he figured if he wanted some answers about who Diane was potentially dating or seeing, or maybe who some of her exes were, he actually knew where he could go to start. Around 9:30 the next morning, Henderson was sitting in a coffee shop across from Diane's best friend, Joanne Govea. Joanne was clearly still processing the murder, and at the moment, she really seemed more angry than anything else. But she told Henderson that she would help any way she could, and that she did know all about the men who were in Diane's life. But of all her romantic partners, there was really only one who concerned her. His name was Mike Prunell, and according to Joanne, he'd been Diane's landlord years ago. After Diane had moved into his building, he'd started showering her with gifts and bugging her to go out with him, and they had ended up dating for a while, but when Diane ended things, Mike had been furious, and Diane had actually had to move to a new place just to get away from him. Now, this obviously got Henderson's attention, and he made a mental note to find Mike as soon as possible. But there was another name that he wanted to ask Joanne about as well. During the search of Diane's house, detectives had found her wallet in the kitchen sink. It had been sitting in the water. And inside of the wallet had been Diane's ID, some credit cards, and then there was also this soggy business card for someone named Mark Baker. And so Henderson asked if Joanne recognized that name. And Joanne said, "Yeah, I do." She said Diane had met Mark Baker at a bar, and they had talked and exchanged contact info, but Joanne didn't know if they'd ever actually followed up. And so Henderson and Joanne spoke for a bit longer, and then eventually they wrapped it up, and Henderson thanked Joanne for the help. And then as he was leaving, he decided that, he really needed to speak to both Mark and Mike, but he would start with Mark because he had his business card. Later that afternoon, Henderson led Mark Baker into the police station's interview room. He offered Mark a seat and a bottle of water, which Mark accepted before asking, what's going on? What is this all about? Mark definitely was pretty annoyed to have been asked to come down here in the middle of the workday with, virtually no explanation. So Henderson decided to just get straight to it. And he explained that he was investigating a murder. Then he pulled out a photo of Diane, put it on the table, and slid it over to Mark. Now, as Henderson did this, he was sort of studying Mark for any sort of reaction when he saw Diane's picture. But Mark just sort of glanced at the photo and then back up at Henderson, and he said, "Am I supposed to know who this is?" And this totally caught Henderson off guard. Henderson told him that the woman's name was Diane, and he knew that Mark had met her at a bar not that long ago. But Mark just shook his head and insisted that that had not happened. He said he definitely didn't know Diane, and he also would not have chatted her up anywhere, because she apparently was not the kind of, quote, target he usually went for. And that word, target, sort of hung in the air very uneasily between them for a long time. And then eventually Henderson just sort of, cleared his throat and asked if Mark would be willing to give a DNA sample. And Mark flat out refused. But this only made Henderson even more determined to get a sample. Now, he couldn't force it without a warrant, but he had another idea. Mark had been drinking from that water bottle that he had given him when he first came in, and he just hoped if Mark left it behind, Henderson could scoop it up and send it off for testing. So he told Mark that he was free to go. But Henderson was disappointed when Mark did not throw the bottle away. Instead, he put the cap back on, pocketed the bottle, and he left. Now, Henderson obviously couldn't prove this, but just from the looks of it, the decision to take the bottle like that, it felt deliberate. And it reminded him of just how careful Diane's killer had been to remove forensic evidence from the crime scene. So he gave Mark a few seconds head start, and then eventually Henderson got up and actually followed Mark out of the station, but kept his distance so that he wouldn't notice he was behind him. And Henderson very carefully trailed Mark all the way down the block. And then at some point, when Mark stopped and sort of looked around for a moment, Henderson froze until he realized Mark was just checking street signs. And then, Mark just kept on walking and Henderson kept on trailing until eventually Mark pulled out that bottle and he chucked it onto the ground. And then as soon as Mark had walked down the road, turned the corner, and disappeared, Henderson ran over, put on a rubber glove, picked up that bottle, and went right back to the police station. And then as soon as he got there, he put it inside of an evidence bag and he sent it off to the crime lab for testing. That evening, around 6 p.m., Henderson was sitting at his desk, staring at his computer screen in total frustration. He was reading the results of a database search for Diane's ex-boyfriend and former landlord, Mike Prunell, and he was running into a problem. Henderson could not find anybody with that name. A moment later, Henderson heard a knock at his door, and he called for whoever it was to come on in. And then when the door opened, he saw his partner, Detective Minacchio, standing there with a middle-aged man. And Minacchio explained that this guy was Diane's brother, Ron Zaleski, and he was here to give whatever information he could about Diane's personal life. And Henderson immediately perked up because he realized that, Ron very likely knew Diane's ex-boyfriends and any current boyfriends. So as they sat down, Henderson asked him if he remembered a man named Mike Purnell. And Ron immediately paused and looked really surprised, and then said, yeah, he knows exactly who Mike is. Because at one point, Mike had actually asked their father for his blessing to marry Diane. According to Ron, none of the family had been in love with that idea, because Mike had seemed like a really shady guy. In fact, he had such a long rap sheet that he didn't even go by his real name. Two days later, on November 22nd, Detective Henderson sat in the interview room across from the man who called himself Mike Purnell. His real name was Lou Hubbard, and at this point, Henderson knew that amongst his rap sheet was a conviction for domestic violence against his ex-wife. Apparently, he had savagely beaten her, and Henderson knew that obviously in this murder case, Diane had been savagely beaten, so there's, a similarity there. Now, Henderson had not told Lou that they knew his real name, and he also hadn't told Lou why he was even here, and Lou hadn't asked. And at the moment, Lou was just sort of leaning back in his chair, sort of like making light of this whole thing, like it was totally hilarious that he was being held inside of a police station. At some point, Henderson asked Lou where he had been on November 17th, and Lou just sort of shrugged and said he couldn't remember anything about that day, like it didn't stand out at all to him. At this point, Henderson pulled out that photo of Diane and he slid it across the table to Lou. And Lou, he just glanced at it and then slid it back across the table and said he had no idea who that was. And to Henderson, this was just completely unbelievable, like literally not believable. Because he knew that Lou had literally proposed to Diane, this woman in the photo. So there was no way he did not recognize her. He had to be lying. At this point, Henderson stood up from the table and he looked at Lou and said, if you want to keep playing dumb, that's fine. Then he stood up and he walked over to the door, he opened it up, and he yelled out for his partner, Detective Minacchio, to bring him the file on Lou. And then a moment later, Minacchio ran down the hall, he handed over the file, and then Henderson went back to the table. Henderson, calm as could be, opened up the file and then began telling Lou that, I know your name's not Mike Purnell. It's Lou Hubbard. I know all about you. I know that at one point you were going to propose or did propose to this woman, Diane, the one in the photo, the one you claim not to know. We know all about it. We know about your criminal record, your domestic violence conviction. We know all about it. At this point, Lou's entire demeanor had changed. It was like he knew he'd been caught. And he just nodded and said, yeah, he knows who she is. And he also said that he had seen on TV that she had been murdered, but he swore he didn't do it. Now, Henderson really didn't believe the guy because he's just caught him lying. But he told him, hey, if you really didn't do it, there's an easy way to prove that. Give us a DNA sample, like literally right now. And after a long pause, Lou agreed. Around 8 a.m. the next morning, November 23rd, Detective Henderson was working at his desk when his phone rang. When he looked at the caller ID and he saw the extension, he knew it was the crime lab. And he assumed they must be calling to confirm receipt of Mark Baker and Lou Hubbard's DNA samples they had sent over. But when Henderson answered, the analyst on the line explained they were actually calling with an update from digital forensics. The digital team had finally accessed the browsing history on Diane's laptop, and they'd found some activity from the hours after Diane was killed. It looked like the killer, while hanging around inside of Diane's house after the murder, had viewed some pornographic websites, and then they'd also used Diane's credit cards to try and order a MacBook and an iPhone, and they had set the delivery address for these items for Diane's house. Now, Henderson was sort of taken aback by all of this, but what stood out was, well, if they're ordering these items to the scene of the crime, it means they planned on coming back to the scene of the crime. But there was also more. Apparently, the digital forensics team had finally gotten into Diane's dating profile, so now they could see everyone that she had messaged or gone out with in the past. And there were literally dozens and dozens of names. And so when Henderson heard that, he knew that now, there were all these new suspects, dozens of them. They would have to swab and question every one of those men. And so now the case had just totally exploded. Around noon on December 2nd, 2010, so about 2 weeks after Diane's murder, Detective Henderson sat in his car outside of an office building in Newark, New Jersey, watching the front entrance. He'd been there all morning, waiting for a worker whose name was Kyle Porter. Kyle was one of the men that Diane had been messaging with online before she was killed. Henderson had already spoken to him over the phone, and Kyle had actually confirmed that he had been to Diane's house just a few weeks before the murder. But what really made Henderson suspicious of Kyle was just the fact that he had refused to submit a DNA sample, even after Henderson explained that doing so would help clear him as a suspect. So now, as Henderson finally saw Kyle step out of the building and head for the parking lot, Henderson got out of his car and literally ran over to intercept him. And as he did, Henderson flashed his badge, and Kyle for a second looked like he maybe wanted to run, but instead he just sort of stammered that he was going to be late for his lunch meeting, sort of suggesting like, I can't talk to you right now. But Henderson had not waited around all morning just to leave empty-handed here. So he told Kyle that he could either give a sample right now and be on his way, or they could talk again when Henderson came back with a warrant for Kyle's arrest. And Kyle seemed terrified by that idea, so he sighed and said, okay, I'll give you a sample. 4 days later, on the morning of December 6th, Henderson was out jogging before his shift when his cell phone rang. He saw that it was the crime lab calling, so he stopped what he was doing and he answered the call. A forensic analyst from the lab was on the line, and he explained that he was calling because they just finished with the first batch of Henderson's blood samples. This batch included the samples for Mark Baker, the man who Henderson had to secretly trail just to pick up his water bottle, as well as Diane's ex-boyfriend, Lou Hubbard, aka Mike Prunell, and also Kyle Porter, the man she had met through online dating who, only after being threatened with arrest, offered up his DNA swab. And so Henderson held his breath as this analyst read off the results. And not one of them matched the blood sample from the crime scene. For a moment, Henderson thought there really had to be a mistake here, because all three of those men had been so suspicious and so uncooperative. Now, he'd always known that, the crime scene blood that he had tested their samples against maybe wasn't from the killer. But if that was true, then Henderson was really in trouble, because it meant that after all this, he had nothing. Now, the blood from the crime scene had already been tested against the state's DNA bank, and there had been no matches. And now he's got no matches here with these three suspects, and so Henderson knew he really had no choice but to keep finding and testing more suspects. And in the next few weeks and then months, he went through this process over and over, interviewing and obtaining DNA samples from the men in Diane's dating profile history and her email contacts, basically every man who had anything to do with her. He went out and interviewed and tested. In fact, over the next year, the detectives conducted more than 100 interviews and took over 80 DNA samples. But one by one, they all turned into dead ends. One morning in December of 2011, Detective Henderson was at his desk on the phone following up about a tip about Diane's case. So a month earlier, on the anniversary of Diane's death, the local news had aired a big special on the case. And then since then, the police station had been flooded with people calling in various tips. And so now, Henderson and Minacchio had had their hands full following up on all these tips, but so far they had gone nowhere. And so Henderson thanked the person he was on the phone with, even though he sort of knew that what they were telling him was not going to be useful. Then he hung up and let out a frustrated sigh. He was starting to think that he had been totally wrong at the start of this murder, that Diane's killer was not someone she knew, but maybe a random intruder who would be even harder to catch. Or even worse would be, maybe the blood they had been testing all of these suspects against for the last year, that blood maybe didn't even belong to the killer. But just then, Minacchio burst into the office and he had a big grin on his face. And he said he had just gotten a call from this woman who had a story that Henderson needed to hear. Minacchio at this point just handed Henderson his cell phone, and so Henderson put the phone to his ear, and sure enough, there was a woman on the line. And this woman explained that she had an online friend that she spoke with all the time. Now, they'd never actually met in person, but they were still pretty close. And they told each other practically everything. And a few days ago, this online friend of hers had sent a very disturbing message where they openly admitted that they had killed Diane Zaleski. And when this woman told Henderson the actual name of this online friend of hers, he was so confused. But then it was like all at once, the world came crashing down around him. because he realized that over a year ago, on the very first day he'd begun investigating Diane's murder, he had made a huge mistake. Based on forensic evidence from the crime scene and the killer's eventual confession, this is what police believe happened to Diane Zaleski on the night of November 17, 2010. The killer was very nervous as they knocked on Diane's front door, because even though they had been here before, tonight was going to be different. Diane eventually came to the door and she opened it up and she seemed sort of surprised to see the killer there. But, she let them inside and asked them, like, what's going on? What are you doing here? And the killer, they hadn't really figured out how they were going to do this. And at some point, they just sort of blurted out the thing they wanted to tell her, which was to tell Diane that they had really intense feelings about her. But as they were sort of like rambling on about all these things they wanted to do with her and how they really just wanted her, Diane stopped them and told them that what they wanted was totally inappropriate and that now they needed to leave. But the killer, after being rejected, refused to leave. And then the killer began to argue. And as they did, they got angrier and angrier until they reached over and grabbed a pair of scissors on the table by the door, and they began stabbing Diane. But Diane, she immediately fought back way harder than the killer had expected, thrashing and kicking until the killer's grip on the scissors slipped. And at that point, the killer actually felt a flash of pain in their hand, and they looked down to see a bloody cut on their hand. But for the killer, this only made them more mad. The killer began to strangle her until finally she stopped moving. Once Diane was still, the killer took their hands off of her and then just sort of looked around at the incredibly bloody mess they'd made in the front of the house. They'd watched enough TV to know that their DNA and fingerprints were probably all over not just Diane's body, but all over the foyer right now. But they also knew that Diane, she lived alone, which meant that nobody was coming home anytime soon, and so they felt like they had plenty of time to clean up this mess. They started by dragging Diane's lifeless body down the hallway to the steps and then down into the basement. And then they cleaned her body with chemicals. And then after that, they went back upstairs and stripped off their own bloody clothes and started a load of laundry. And while they waited for their laundry to be done, the killer just sort of made themselves at home. They took a shower, they watched TV, they cooked and ate a bowl of pasta, and they used Diane's laptop to look at pornography and also do some online shopping with Diane's credit card. And then once the killer's clothes were clean and dry, they put them back on and then collected the items that they had handled, like Diane's wallet and her TV remote, and dumped them in the sink with a bunch of soapy water. Then they went around the house blasting everything with a fire extinguisher from under the sink to destroy trace evidence, and also they went ahead and wiped down the laptop to make sure there was no DNA or fingerprints on that as well. And then finally, sometime in the early hours of the morning after the murder, the killer, after having done all they could, they just casually walked out the door into the falling snow and crossed the street and went into their mother's house. Because the killer was Arnell Yearwood, Diane's neighbor's son. So the huge mistake that investigators made at the very beginning of this investigation was when they found out that the neighbor across the street, Mrs. Yearwood, that her son apparently did chores for Diane. Well, the mistake they made, in particular Detective Henderson, was when Mrs. Yearwood went into the back of the house and came back with that 11-year-old boy that they spoke to that said he didn't see anything strange across the street the day before, they assumed that boy was Mrs. Yearwood's son, and he was the one who was doing chores for Diane. And basically, they're like looking at this kid who's totally innocent, thinking, okay, clearly this kid who's been across the street in her house is not a person of interest. He did not kill anybody. And so the son of Mrs. Yearwood was just sort of forgotten about. What they didn't realize is that 11-year-old boy was not Mrs. Yearwood's son. It was her grandson. Her actual son was a 26-year-old man, Arnell Yearwood, who was actually inside the house on that day. He was hiding in her house. But they just never clarified. They assumed the kid was her son and just sort of wrote off any chance that her son could be involved. And so Detective Henderson and Minacchio didn't put it together until over a year later when they got that tip from that woman who said her online friend confessed to the murder, and his name was Arnell Yearwood. And so ultimately, Diane let Arnell into her house on the night she was killed because she knew and trusted him. He did chores at her house. But he tried to initiate a sexual relationship with her. She rejected him, and so he killed her. Arnell Yearwood was ultimately arrested on April 7th, 2012, so about a year and a half after killing Diane. He would confess to the murder and was sentenced to 30 years in prison. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have a whole playlist of true crime episodes ready for you to binge right now. So click here and give them a watch. All right, until next time, see ya. Sometimes the truth is stranger than fiction. And today I'm going to share 3 stories that all demonstrate that. But before we get into those stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do, and we upload 2, 3, even 4 times every week. So if that's of interest to you, please sneak into the like button's house and secretly glue one thumbtack upturned on the surface of their favorite chair. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's stories. One morning in October, very late during World War II, a Japanese soldier named Lieutenant Hiro Onoda crept out of the jungle on a small island in the Philippines called Lubang and crouched down at the edge of a huge rice field. Another soldier named Kazuka came out of the jungle behind him, and together they carefully crawled toward these huge bundles of rice that had just been harvested by the local farmers. And when they reached the first bundle, Onoda took 2 torches out of his bag. So when Onoda first arrived in Lubang, his mission had been to destroy the island's airfield, but everything had gone completely wrong. Allied forces, who were the enemy of the Japanese, had attacked the island, and the Japanese had evacuated. But by accident, they had left Onoda and Kozuka behind. And as far as they knew, there could be others who had been left behind as well, but as for right now, it was just those 2. But even though these 2 soldiers really had no idea if they would survive this, if they would ever get rescued or not, they still had a mission to do, and that was, to attack the enemy. And these bundles of rice, they knew were going to be sent to the other side to feed their enemy. And so they had to destroy them. So now Onoda lit the 2 torches, and then he and Kozuka set fire to the first bundle of rice. And then they took off running, stopping every few feet to set fire to another bundle of rice until the entire field was on fire. Gunshots rang out, and Onoda realized the enemy must have seen them, so he and Kazuka dropped their torches and they fled back into the jungle. Now, this pattern of attacking and sabotaging their enemy and then retreating back to the jungle where they could hide out was one they had done many, many times. It was sort of like the one thing that anchored their existence. They were actively still fighting the enemy until either they were killed or rescued. That was their North Star. Normally, they were quite good at this and they would be able to escape the enemy and get back to the jungle. But this time, as they were running away and Onoda's dodging bullets, literally, he heard Kozuka yell out behind him and then fall to the ground. A few weeks later, Onoda was alone, and he was patrolling the north side of the island. Kozuka had been shot and killed during their rice field sabotage, and so now Onoda was very likely the only Japanese soldier left on this island. And while Onoda knew, he was honor-bound to keep on fighting even by himself, which was obviously mentally much harder to do, by now he was just exhausted and depressed, living off banana peels and whatever else he could steal from local farmers. It was a pretty miserable existence. And also, ever since the Allied forces had killed Kazuka, they had somehow learned Onoda's name, and they'd stepped up their operations targeting him specifically. Onoda had had to leave the jungle and move into this underground cave he had found. But even there, he could still hear the sound of fighter jets flying overhead, clearly looking for him. And sometimes groups of enemy soldiers would patrol the jungle looking for him, which was near his cave, and they would call out for him by name and tell him to stop hiding and come on out. Now, as Onoda continued his patrol, he heard voices. So naturally, he crouched down and hid behind a boulder. And soon, 3 enemy soldiers came into view, and they clearly had no idea that Onoda was watching them because their rifles were slung over their shoulders and they were just kind of joking around with each other. But Onoda still panicked because he knew pretty soon they would notice his footprints and they would track him to his hiding spot. So even though there was clearly a part of Onoda that was very ready to be done fighting this war, finally, even if it meant being captured, really, he still forced himself to raise his rifle, take aim, and fire. Months passed by, and Onoda knew it was very likely springtime, and it had been weeks since he had seen any enemy soldiers on his patrols. He was holed up in his underground cave, and he was reading a letter that he had saved from home. And then he heard movement overhead, and somebody above ground called his name. So instinctively, Onoda reached for his rifle, but before he could do anything like pop out of the cave and start shooting, the person who had called out began to speak. And Onoda realized he knew this voice, and it was not an enemy soldier at all. Onoda crawled out of the cave, and when he saw the person standing there who was speaking to him, he just began to weep. It was his commanding officer, who he had been waiting for all this time. And the commanding officer was walking toward him with a group of other soldiers, friendly soldiers. Onoda climbed to his feet and immediately saluted the officer and asked if he was finally allowed to go home. And the officer said yes, because it would turn out that the date was March 9th, 1974. World War II had ended 29 years earlier. Onoda had spent almost 3 decades terrorizing not enemy soldiers, but Filipino farmers and villagers and police officers who he had simply mistaken for enemy troops because he believed they were still in this war. The Japanese government had thought Onoda and Kazuko were dead, but after Kazuko was killed and his body was recovered, Japan sent search parties out onto this island looking for Onoda. And Onoda thought the searchers were basically enemies trying to capture him until he heard the voice of his old commanding officer. And at that point, he finally came out and laid down his arms. When Onoda finally returned to Japan, he received a hero's welcome, but it was sort of tainted because, innocent lives were lost when he was on this island believing he was fighting a war. In many ways, he was sort of terrorizing innocent people. He just didn't know it. And so the whole event was very sensitive, and ultimately Onoda went on to write an autobiography called No Surrender, and he would become a rancher and move to Brazil, where he would live until 2014, where he would die from heart failure. BetterHelp is the paid partner of today's video. The strangest part isn't coming home. It's realizing you came back, but your mind didn't. You're trying to move through life doing everything right, work, family, responsibilities. But small moments feel off, and later you're left thinking, what's wrong with me? I also went through these exact same feelings when I left the military. My mind was very conflicted because the world sort of expected me to be normal, but it was like my nervous system still expected danger all the time. Trauma doesn't stay back there. It rewires you. It changes how you react, how you trust, how you love. But therapy can help break that pattern. BetterHelp makes that support easier to access. You fill out a short questionnaire and get matched with a credentialed therapist in as little as a couple of days. If it's not the right fit, you can switch anytime. Join the 6 million plus people who have gotten help from BetterHelp, the platform you can trust. Click the link in the description or go to betterhelp.com/MrBallen and get 10% off your first month of therapy. Around 11 p.m. on April 19, 1958, a 22-year-old man named Frank Isco drove along a coastal road in Santa Cruz, California, with 2 of his friends inside of his pickup truck. The road they were on was called West Cliff Drive, and it was this beautiful, scenic street that went along a cliff right next to the ocean, so it's got this amazing view. However, as Frank drove, he really couldn't see very much because it was nighttime and the road didn't have any streetlights, so the view was kind of lost on him. Frank glanced over at his friends, but they were both half asleep, and Frank himself was also pretty close to nodding off. So all 3 of the guys were completely exhausted because that morning they'd driven 50 miles from their hometown to Santa Cruz, and then they'd spent all day outside at the beach. Now they were all anxious to get home and just go to bed. Frank was especially ready to get home because his wife, Margaret, always waited up for him. And right now, she was pregnant with their first child, so he really didn't want to keep her up all night. So Frank pressed his foot harder on the gas pedal, and he zoomed along, enjoying the ocean view as much as he could see it, and also listening to the sound of the waves, and began thinking about his wife. But as he drove along, he came up on this sharp curve in the road that he just hadn't seen because it was so dark out, and he was going so fast that when he hit the brakes, even though he began to slow down, he wasn't slowing down fast enough. And so he jerked his wheel trying to avoid what was going to happen here, but the truck, it spun out of control. Frank heard his friends wake up and start screaming, and Frank's desperately trying to will the car away from the edge of this road because there's a cliff down to the ocean, but it's like he just couldn't do it. The truck was spinning, and at the last second, he looked out his window and he saw his headlights were beaming off the metal barrier that kept you from going off the cliff, and he knew there was nothing he could do. And they slammed into the barrier, and then he felt the truck lurch past the barrier, and all of a sudden, it's like they're weightless as he and his friends are falling off the cliff down to the ocean. In this split second, as they're literally falling off a cliff, Frank squeezed his eyes shut and just screamed along with his friends. And he expected at any moment that his truck was going to fall into the water, and water would pour in through the windows, and they would all just sink and drown. There'd be nothing they could do. But amazingly, Frank felt the truck slam into something that was unexpectedly hard. It clearly was not water. And suddenly they weren't falling anymore, and there was no water pouring into the truck. Frank was obviously disoriented from the impact and the darkness and all the confusion, and he really couldn't see what was going on, but he kind of checked himself and he could tell like he was okay, and he looked over at his friends, and they too are completely shaken up, but alive. Everybody's okay, at least physically. And so Frank kind of frantically asked them before they even figured out what was going on here, like, hey, are you guys good? And his friends are like, yeah, we're good. And then instinctively, one of his friends who was sitting on the passenger side of the car opened up the passenger side door and kind of carefully looked out to see what was going on here. And the friends sort of looked at the other two and just said, we're stuck on a ledge. We got caught on a ledge. For a second, all three of the friends just froze. It was almost like if we move too much, maybe the car will rock off the ledge and fall the rest of the way down. But the friend kind of looked out again, and it seemed like they were actually stable on this ledge. Basically, by some miracle, they had only fallen maybe 20 feet down this cliff, hit this ledge, and stopped instead of careening all the way down to the ocean, which, would have likely been death. Frank was so relieved and was so just amazed at their turn of luck in some ways that they had landed miraculously right here that he just started to laugh, because all they'd have to do now is just carefully climb out and flag down a motorist. The road was like 20 feet above them. They could definitely get to the road or at least signal somebody on the road, and they'd be okay. And so Frank's two friends, they climbed fully out of the truck and actually stood on the rocky ledge on the passenger side. They get out, they're standing there, they're kind of surveying the ocean, thanking their lucky stars that they've survived. And Frank, he wants to get out too, to join them. But he decides to go out his door, open up his door and get out on the ledge that way. But as soon as he tried to open his door, he found it was stuck. And so instead, he just began rolling down his window and began climbing out. At the same time Frank was doing this, Frank's friends who were standing out on the ledge, they turned around to just look at him to see what he was doing. They could really only see, through the car, the shadowy shape of him in the darkness, but they watched as he clearly was climbing out his window to presumably get out on the ledge and join them. But the instant he climbed out on the other side of the car, even though it was dark, they could sort of see him. The second he climbed out, it was like Frank just vanished. For a second, his friends were like, Frank, where'd you go? Like, where are you? But there was no response. And so carefully, the friends kind of walked around the truck to see what Frank was doing. And when they saw what was on the other side of the truck, where Frank presumably landed when he jumped out of the truck, they were horrified. It would turn out the ledge that Frank and his friends had landed on, the one that had saved their lives, was not an entirely solid surface, or more specifically, it was porous. In particular, there was one hole, big enough for a person to fit through. And that hole was on the immediate outside of the driver's side of the truck. And that hole that Frank didn't see when he jumped out of the window and he fell into, that hole was the entrance to an underwater cave. And Frank, who survived the fall, is now in this dark cave. He has no idea what's happened, and he starts trying to figure out a way out, and there's all these tunnels going everywhere. There's a little bit of water in there, but it's not very deep, and he got lost inside of this cave, and his friends are calling out to him. Rescuers showed up, but by the time the tide came in a couple hours later, Frank was nowhere near the entrance to the hole, so he couldn't let the water rise him up to the exit. He just had to wait for the water to fill in the space he was in, and he drowned. On the afternoon of December 19th, 1966, a 59-year-old man named Dr. Mohammed Ibrahim sat in a conference room inside of a government building in Cairo, Egypt. He was there as an employee of the Egyptian government, and he was sitting across from two governmental representatives from France. He felt very nervous because he'd been meeting with these same two men and trying to come to an agreement with them about a very important diplomatic decision for the last 4 months. But so far, they had not been able to make a deal. And that was because these French representatives wanted Mohammed, who was the Director General of Egyptian Antiques, to help them put together an exhibition in Paris that was all about ancient Egypt. And they specifically wanted Mohammed to loan them a collection of artifacts from an ancient Egyptian pharaoh's tomb. But Mohammed was afraid to loan these artifacts out because he and many other people in his world believed that these particular artifacts were sacred and should not be transported outside of Egypt because it was disrespectful to the pharaoh himself. So on this particular day, Mohammed just said to these French representatives that, guys, we're never going to reach a deal because I'm just not willing to loan these out. It feels disrespectful to this pharaoh. And he knew this sounded kind of crazy because the pharaoh has been dead for thousands of years, but that's how Mohammed felt. And he really wanted them to understand that this was not something he could change. This is how he felt. That's how it is. Now, up until this point, Mohammed, again, had been trying to make a deal with them, but had never really come out and said that ultimately his main sticking point is this disrespect of the pharaoh. And so this is the first time the French representatives are hearing this. And from Mohammed's perspective, when he said this to them, it looked like they almost wanted to laugh, like, are you kidding? But when they realized Mohammed was being completely serious here, they sort of shifted and had these looks of almost sympathy come across their faces. And then they promised Mohammed that, if you loan us these artifacts, that's not going to be disrespectful. In fact, if anything, it would actually honor the pharaoh because it would allow people all over France to see and appreciate the artifacts from his tomb. Mohammed and the French representatives went back and forth on this topic for hours. And eventually, Mohammed did start to see their side of things. It did make sense to him that maybe, allowing France to display the artifacts was a way of not disrespecting the pharaoh, but honoring the pharaoh. And so finally, perhaps against his better judgment, Mohammed officially agreed to loan out the artifacts, and then the meeting adjourned. A few minutes later, Mohammed walked out of the government building onto the busy sidewalk outside, and he felt lighter than he had in months. The deal was done, and he didn't have to think about it anymore. This was great. Now, all Mohammed wanted to do was just go home. So he began walking towards the parking lot where his car was. And as he was heading across the street, looking straight ahead, he heard a loud blaring noise and a screeching sound, and then everything went black. It would turn out those artifacts Mohammed had just agreed to loan out were from the tomb of the ancient Egyptian pharaoh king Tutankhamun. And Mohammed, along with many, many others, believed that these artifacts were not just sacred, but were also cursed. And that was because over the years, at least 11 people who had a connection to these artifacts had died. And it was believed that anybody who disrespected the artifacts would face King Tut's wrath. And just minutes after Mohammed convinced himself to agree to loan out these artifacts to France, he walked out of the government building in Cairo and he was hit and killed by a truck. His death made headlines all over the world because to this day, some people say this was just a horrible accident, but others insist he was yet another victim of King Tut's curse. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have hundreds of videos for you to binge right now. But if you're looking for a recommendation from me of that one video that's worth your time, well, it's this one right here. So give it a watch. All right, until next time, see ya. At a certain point in today's story, you're going to hear what sounds like the end of the story, like the final reveal. Except it's not. There's a whole nother layer to this story if you just stick around, and it is completely insane. But before we get into today's story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place, because that's all we do, and we upload 2, 3, even 4 times every week. So if that's of interest to you, please offer to take the like button on an amazing vacation to this gorgeous private island with this beautiful beach. But as soon as you pilot the boat in and drop them off, you just turn around and drive away and don't come back. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Okay, let's get into today's story. On the afternoon of May 2nd, 1962, a middle-aged woman named Angelina Narcisse walked into a hospital room inside the Hôpital Albert Schweitzer, which is a medical center in central Haiti. Inside, Angelina saw one of her brothers, 40-year-old Clervius, propped up in the hospital bed. He had an IV sticking out of one arm, and he had an oxygen mask strapped over his face. His eyes were closed, and when Angelina touched his hand and said hello, he didn't react. So Angelina had just been briefed by Clervius's doctors about what was going on here. She knew that 2 days earlier, her brother had come to the hospital coughing up blood and also running a dangerously high fever. Doctors had managed to get his fever down, but they determined that his blood pressure was really high and he also had fluid accumulating in his lungs. But they didn't know why any of that was happening or how to control it or stop it. So now, less than 48 hours after Clervius' symptoms began, he was barely conscious. And so for Angelina, it was obviously, very scary to see her brother so sick like this, but it was also confusing because she knew that one of her other brothers had seen Clervius just a few hours before he had shown up at the hospital with these horrible symptoms. And Clervius, at the time, had seemed completely fine. So really, this illness seemed to have come out of nowhere. But as Angelina looked around the hospital room, she also found herself feeling pretty annoyed because she had 4 other siblings, 2 more brothers and 2 sisters, and none of them were here. Now, Angelina knew she shouldn't be surprised. Ever since their parents had died, there had been basically nonstop drama between all the siblings, and most of the drama centered around Clervius himself. So when their parents had passed away, Clervius was the one who had ultimately inherited their money and land. And so these days, he was sort of living like a king. He lived in one of the nicest places in their village and was constantly flaunting his wealth. Meanwhile, Angelina and her other siblings really struggled financially. And anytime they asked Clervius for help, he refused, which had caused a huge rift in the family. So Angelina was now the only one who'd even shown up to visit him in the hospital, despite his condition being so dire. But, nonetheless, she sat down on a plastic chair inside the room, and for a few minutes, she just watched Clervius breathing. And for a while, his breathing seemed normal. It was rhythmic, slow, but normal. But then suddenly, Clervius's breath seemed to almost catch in his chest. And then he began making a sort of wheezing, gurgling sound, but he's like half conscious. So it was like his body was reacting to not being able to breathe. Angelina instinctively just stood up and grabbed her brother's hand and began to squeeze it. And as she did, she saw her brother's eyelids flutter open for a second, but then his eyelids closed. And she watched as underneath his eyelids, she could see his eyes kind of darting around all over the place. And then at the same time, this sort of wheezing sound that was coming out of her brother turned into a choking noise. And so Angelina at this point let go of her brother's hand, she ran into the hallway and she found a doctor. But unfortunately, by the time she explained what was going on and she and this doctor returned to the hospital room, they found Clervius no longer making any noise. He was totally still. And so the doctor rushed over to him and he checked for a pulse, but he couldn't find one. And he turned to Angelina and he said, "I'm sorry, but your brother is dead." The following morning, May 3rd, Angelina arrived at the small cemetery near their village for her brother's funeral. And she was glad to see that at least this time, her 4 remaining siblings had decided to show up. But at the same time, Angelina, she was in shock. She couldn't believe what had happened. The doctors had told her that ultimately Clairvius had died from something called malignant hypertension, which is basically blood pressure that's so high it causes organ damage. And also it causes pulmonary edema, which is fluid in the lungs that can ultimately make it impossible to breathe, which very likely was what that sound was her brother was making before he died, that choking sound. But the doctors told Angelina that despite knowing sort of what actually happened to Clairvius, they didn't know why it happened. It was totally unclear how he got these symptoms in the first place. And unfortunately for Angelina and their family, it seemed pretty unlikely that they would ever figure it out. It would just be this mystery. Now, as Angelina walked up to Clairvius' gravesite, she looked down and she saw her brother lying dead inside of his open casket. She reached out and touched his hand one last time, and it was so cold that Angelina pulled it away right away, and then she began to cry. The ceremony was kind of a blur for Angelina. The whole thing just felt surreal. But eventually it wrapped up, and Angelina and her other siblings were walking up to the casket to say their final goodbyes to their brother. And then after they did, they stepped back and they watched as cemetery employees closed Clairvius' casket and lowered it into the ground. However, after Angelina and her family had all returned to their homes and were, beginning to grieve the loss of their brother, something else began to happen at that cemetery. BetterHelp is the paid partner of today's video. Sometimes I think about being a kid, riding in the back seat at night, street lights flashing across the window, no responsibilities, no real fear of the future. Well, if I could say something to that little kid version of me, I'd probably say, you're gonna be okay, but don't rush it. Don't wish this away. Because when things get hard, it's easy to start looking backwards. Nostalgia is basically a highlight reel. And then you look at your present and it doesn't stand a chance. Here's the thing though, the life you are living right now, you're going to feel nostalgic for this someday. And so if you spend it longing for something that's already gone, you'll miss it twice. If reaching for the past is getting in the way of living now, therapy may help you figure out what you're actually looking for. And it might also help you to start finding more of that in the present. BetterHelp makes starting therapy easier. Take the quiz and get matched with a credentialed therapist quickly, and switch anytime at no extra cost if it's not the right fit. Click the link in the description or go to betterhelp.com/MrBallen and get 10% off your first month of therapy. That same night, a little after midnight, 2 men sort of conspicuously entered the small cemetery carrying shovels. As they walked, they kind of kept looking around to make sure nobody was watching them, and they went up to Clairvius' very fresh grave. And with their shovels, they dug and dug until finally they revealed his casket, and they pulled his casket out of the ground, they pried the nails off the top, they flipped it open, and there was Clairvius' body. And they pulled his body out, and they laid it on the ground next to the hole in the ground. Then, as fast as they could, they closed the casket back up, now with Clairvius' body again outside of it on the ground nearby, and they reburied the casket. They put all the dirt back, all the grass back, made it look like nobody had touched it. And then after that was done, they walked over to Clairvius' body and they tied his wrists and ankles together with rope. Then they wrapped Clairvius' body in a large black cloth, and then together they hoisted his body up and placed him on their respective shoulders. And together they carried him out of the cemetery and off into the wilderness on the outskirts of the village. And then when the sun began to rise, they stopped and found a good spot to hide along with Clairvius' body in the trees. And then when the sun went back down again, the 2 men were up and on the move again with the body. These men did this for days until finally they reached a massive fenced-in plot of land in northern Haiti. When they got there, it was just starting to get light outside. And so with the light, they could see dozens and dozens of these people moving through this vast field in front of them. And all these people were moving in a sort of jerky, unnatural way. And all of them were holding machetes. But these 2 men who had lugged Clairvius' body here were not afraid. They unlocked the fence and carried Clairvius' body right up a pathway through the middle of this field, past all these people. But as they passed by these machete-wielding people, They didn't even seem to notice the men or the body. It was like this was totally normal. Eventually, the men reached the middle of this field where there was this building, and the men went inside. And the interior of this building was basically one large room with a table in the center and a bunch of shelves that lined the walls. And the shelves were all stacked with glass containers that had things in them like dried plants and some taxidermied smaller animals, and also what appeared to be some human bones. And standing in the middle of this room was these two men's boss. He was a very old man, and he had this very expectant look on his face. Without saying a word, the two men placed Clervius's body on the table in the center of this room, and they unwrapped the black cloth around him. Their boss looked very carefully at Clervius's face, and then he smiled, and he handed each of the men a stack of money. 18 years later, in February of 1980, Clervius's sister, Angelina, walked through an outdoor market in her small village in central Haiti. Now, by this point, it had been almost 2 decades since Clervius had died, and Angelina didn't really think about him that much anymore. But on this particular day, as she was shopping, an old man approached her, and he was very thin, his face was very sunken, and he had this long, deep scar on his cheek that went from the side of his mouth to his ear. And his eyes were bloodshot, and they were kind of wide, like he was sort of wild. And in this gravelly voice, he told her that his name was Clervius, and that he was her brother. But when Angelina saw this guy and heard this, she did not think this was her brother. She thought, this man is obviously out of his mind, or he's lying, or both. But this is clearly not my brother Clervius. He's dead. And on top of that, like in addition to all the discrepancies that she's immediately clocking, this man did not remotely look like her brother did. He looked completely different. In particular, there was this big scar on his face that she certainly didn't remember on Clervius's face. So Angelina told this man that, no, you are not my brother and you need to leave me alone. But the man, when he heard this, he sort of freaked out, and he grabbed Angelina's shoulders and started violently shaking her, insisting that no, he really was Clervius. Angelina screamed, and the next thing she knew, she was surrounded by a crowd of very confused but worried onlookers. And then a police officer walked over and grabbed the man and dragged him away. Later that same day, a police officer sat in an interview room at the police station across from this older man who kept insisting he was Clervius. And the story that this man told the officer about how he could be a man who had died 18 years earlier really was absolutely insane. Because this man claimed that 18 years earlier, when he died, he remembered that moment because he heard the doctor literally pronounce him dead, and he heard his siblings start to cry. And then he remembered the cold when the hospital staff moved him to the refrigerated morgue. And then he remembered the sound of them nailing his coffin shut. And he remembered what it felt like when one of those nails punctured through and cut his cheek. That's how he got that big scar on his face. It was a nail in his coffin going through his face. Basically, he wasn't dead. He was totally mentally conscious of everything happening to him. He just physically couldn't move or react in any way, and he didn't know why. But everybody thought he was dead, and he wasn't. And then he said later that same night, as he's literally in a coffin underground, basically waiting to suffocate to death, he became aware of 2 men suddenly unearthing him and removing him from his coffin, and then they tied him up, wrapped him in cloth, and then carried him into the wilderness for days. And then finally, they entered this building in the middle of this field, and they set him down on this table. And then he heard this third man thank the man that had carried him, and then this third man poured something into Clervius's mouth, and then this guy just started chanting over and over again. And then a few minutes later, he found his body sort of was beginning to work again. He could open his eyes, he could sort of move his limbs, but things just felt different. Like suddenly his vision was very strange and hazy, and his body movements were jerky and uncoordinated. It almost felt like his mind was moving slower than it really was supposed to, like it was just dumbed down or something. And it was at that point that Clervius said he realized what was actually going on here. Clervius said this old man that had poured whatever in his mouth and was now chanting, he was a Bokor, which is a voodoo priest in Haiti. And Clervius said the Bokor had used a potion to turn Clervius into a zombie. Clervius told the police officer that he'd been absolutely terrified and he wanted to fight back, But his body felt like jello, and he could barely form a coherent thought, so there was no way he could actually do anything. He said the Bokor, shortly after this, untied him, made him stand up, and then marched him outside of this building. And he said everything looked so blurry outside, but he could tell, despite his vision, that he was in the middle of a huge sugarcane field. And he saw at least a dozen other people moving in the same sort of awkward, jerky way that he knew he was, harvesting the sugarcane with machetes. The Bokor at this point handed Clervius a machete and told him to get out there and join them and get to work. Now, something deep in Clervius's mind told him to use the machete to attack the Bokor so he could escape, but he said he didn't. Instead, he just walked out into the field and did start working. And he kept working day in and day out in this bizarre zombie-like state for 2 full years. Then one day, another one of these zombies finally did attack and kill the Bokor. And suddenly all the zombies were free. But the man saying he was Clervius did not go straight home. He couldn't, because he knew this Bokor had not randomly targeted him. He had been hired, the Bokor had been hired to turn Clervius into a zombie. And in the mind of this man who claimed to be Clervius, there was only one person who would have hired this Bokor to do that, and that person was still alive back home in his village. And so if he returned, they would very likely just kill him. So this man told the police officer that he had gone on to spend 16 years just wandering around northern Haiti, working random odd jobs, just kind of barely surviving. But he said he did keep up with news from his village. And when he saw that the person who he believed had ultimately hired the Bokor to do this to him, when he saw that person had died, he said he felt safe enough to finally go back home. Now, after hearing the story, the police officer did not immediately think, boy, this is legitimate, this must have happened. Instead, he thought this sounded completely insane. But just in case, he went to Clervius's siblings and he asked them to give him a list of questions that only the real Clervius could answer, like super specific information from their childhood and things like that. And when the officer came back with this list and began asking this man the questions, the man claiming to be Clervius answered all of them correctly. This really was Clervius. The news of Clervius's return from the dead quickly spread all across the globe. But for the most part, when people outside of Haiti read or heard about it, they assumed the story was just folklore or some kind of hoax. But in 1982, so 20 years after Clervius supposedly died, and 2 years after he supposedly came back to life, a Harvard University researcher named Wade Davis actually traveled to Haiti to investigate the story. And what he found was that Clervius was definitely telling the truth. Here's what many scientists and Clervius's family believe really happened to him on the morning of April 30th, 1962, when he first got really sick. So that morning, he did wake up feeling perfectly fine. He was completely healthy, just like his sister Angelina had thought. But according to Clervius himself, that same afternoon, one of his brothers came over and said he just wanted to put the whole family drama, about the inheritance behind them, and then he gave Clervius a hug. But what Clervius did not know at the time was that during this hug, his brother intentionally rubbed a fine powder onto his skin. Now, this powder did make Clervius incredibly sick, but it was not designed to kill him. Instead, it completely paralyzed him. He couldn't move his arms, his legs, his eyes, nothing, and it lowered his heart rate so low that doctors thought Clervius was dead, which is exactly what Clervius's brother and the Bokor he conspired with had planned for. They knew he would be determined to be dead, he would be buried really quickly, and then right after he was buried, the Bokor sent those 2 men to dig Clervius up while he was still paralyzed. They carried him off to that sugarcane plantation where he became a slave. Basically, he was given drugs every day and forced to work nonstop. And for the brother, Clervius's brother, the reason he did this is to punish Clervius for being so selfish with the money he inherited from their parents. This was the plan, to turn him into that zombie slave. It would turn out the active ingredient in the paralyzing powder that the brother rubbed on Clervius was tetrodotoxin, which is a poison found in pufferfish. and then the active ingredient in the liquid that the Bokor gave Clearvius when he arrived and then continued to give him on a near daily basis to keep him in line was called the zombie's cucumber, which is a hallucinogenic plant that's native to Haiti. After returning to his village and telling his story to the world, Clearvius actually would go on to live a relatively normal life. He would live with his siblings until he died in 1994 at the age of 72. Even though, he was able to clearly articulate who did this to him, his brother and the Bokor, both of them were dead by the time he returned and told his story, so nobody was ever held to account for any of this. Hey everyone, just a reminder, I'm going on tour this year, which means if you go, you can experience never-before-heard stories from me live and in person. We did this in 2024 and people loved it. So get your tickets today at tour.ballenstudios.com right now before they sell out. That's tour.ballenstudios.com. I can't wait to see you all at the shows. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought of today's episode in the comments. And remember, we have hundreds of videos for you to binge right now. But if you're looking for a recommendation from me of that one video that's worth your time, well, it's this one right here. So give it a watch. All right, until next time, see ya.